A creature stands at the edge, on the precipice between life and death. Silent. No cry, no movement. Its eyes, full of despair, seem to look deep into your soul. I have nothing left to lose, it seems to whisper in the stillness. A wild horse, standing on the brink of a deep chasm. The wind howls, ripping through the air. The ground beneath its hooves begins to fracture. Below, death awaits, reaching out. Behind, are wounds that have not healed, memories that can never be erased. There is only one man, a man who once swore he would never save another life again, and now, he is the only one who can save this horse. But does he have the strength to face the pain that has killed all the faith within him? One glance. One step. One hand reaching out. No words, just silence, between life and death, between regret and redemption. What happens when a man who has lost all hope is forced to face the choice of saving a life, and saving himself? The miracle begins. But will the miracle be strong enough to change fate? Or will it be yet another failure in a life where the price to be paid is more than what a soul can endure? Sierra Nevada. A vast mountain range stretching over 400 miles across California and Nevada, where the snow-capped peaks kiss the clouds, the pine forests seem endless, and the canyons run so deep that even sunlight hesitates to reach them. Tucked away in the most secluded corner of the woods, far beyond where any trail dares to wander, stood an old wooden cabin. It bore no nameplate, had no cell signal, and hadn't seen a single visitor in 4 years, except for one man, Lucas Hale. Once known in the town below as the Angel of Horses, Lucas was a veterinarian who had saved dozens of horses from pain, sickness, and even death itself. But then, it happened, just once. His own horse, Shadow, his closest companion, collapsed and died from an internal rupture Lucas hadn't detected in time. And just like that, his entire world unraveled. From that day forward, Lucas cut ties with everyone. He sold his home, left his clinic, and vanished without a word. People whispered he had disappeared. The truth was, he hadn't disappeared, he was hiding. Hiding from people, from the question that haunted him, what did I miss? And from Shadow's mournful eyes that followed him in every dream. Each day, Lucas woke long before the sun stretched over the ridge. He lit a fire with dry wood, boiled water in a dented old tin kettle, and ate bland oatmeal that tasted more like memory than food. By day, he trapped small animals, fished in icy streams, or mended the makeshift fences around his cabin. Sometimes, he climbed to the western cliffs with a pair of weathered binoculars, gazing out across the valley below like a tired traveler looking back at a world he no longer belonged to. He wasn't looking for anything. He wasn't waiting for anything. He simply watched. Silently. As if waiting for something to appear, something he himself didn't yet know. That day, something did appear. A dark amber blur, barely moving, but unmistakably alive, against the gray rock face. Lucas was absent-mindedly scanning the cliffs when his hand froze. On a narrow ledge, nearly half a mile away, stood a wild Mustang. No saddle. No reins. No signs of ever being owned. Just pure, raw wilderness. Its hind legs trembled visibly. The wind whipped its tangled mane, and beneath its hooves yawned a deadly drop, a sheer cliff littered with dagger-like rocks. One wrong move, and the fragile thread of life would snap. Lucas lowered the binoculars. His heart thundered, not from fear, but from something he hadn't felt in years, the pull to act. He raised the binoculars again. The horse's back leg was tangled in a thick bramble clinging to the cliff's edge. That thorny snare might be the only thing keeping it from falling, but it also trapped the animal on a slow, helpless descent toward death. Lucas held his breath. His blood felt cold in his veins. The image was eerily familiar, too familiar. Shadow had looked just like that in her final moments, exhausted, defeated, and beyond his reach. Then, in his mind, something cracked like thunder. Don't let it happen again. He bolted into the cabin, throwing open the old chest in the corner. Rope? Hunting knife. A small emergency kit for horses, something he'd kept, not out of hope, but because he could never quite throw it away. His hands trembled. Not from the cold, but because even now, he couldn't tell, was he trying to save this horse, or some part of himself he had buried 4 years ago? When Lucas reached the ridge, the wind struck his face like a slap, testing his resolve. The horse still stood there. Its hind legs now partly collapsed, its head drooping, chest heaving with every breath. Lucas didn't rush. He kept a safe distance, 20 meters or so. Rope coiled in his hand, eyes steady. He whispered, more to himself than to the horse. If you fall, I don't think I can take another one. The Mustang lifted its head. For a moment, barely a heartbeat, their eyes locked. No panic. No anger. Just an eerie, quiet surrender. And that gaze, it was what pulled Lucas back from the edge of his own guilt-soaked abyss. Then, he stepped forward. The night wind rustled through the pine forest like whispers from a time long gone. In a small wooden cabin nestled on the slope of the Sierra Nevada, Lucas Hale sat still by the window, a cup of tea long gone cold in his hand. He couldn't sleep. The image of the lone wild horse standing at the edge of the cliff kept replaying in his mind like a ghost that wouldn't leave. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the last light of day sweeping across the horse's back, its shadow cast long across the rocky face, as if signaling that something was about to break. If only he had never taken up that profession. If only he had never placed his hands on the fading heartbeats of four-legged souls who once looked at him as their savior. If only he hadn't failed. Lucas gripped the mug tightly. A sharp pain stirred in his chest. Memories of Shadow, the horse he couldn't save, surged up. That day, too, had a cliff. That day, too, had eyes filled with trust from a creature that didn't speak the human tongue. And then, that trust shattered beneath the wheels of fate. He let out a long breath, stood up, and wandered across the cabin like a man sleepwalking. Outside, snow had started to fall lightly. In the silence so deep he could hear the soft crackling of the firewood, Lucas whispered, as if answering a question only he could hear. This time, will it be different? The next morning. The sky had yet to fully brighten. Dim light swept silently across the snow-covered ground, forming soft edges like brush strokes in an old ink painting. Lucas slipped on a heavy coat, tied down his pant legs, and stuffed a coil of rope and an old veterinary kit, untouched for years, into his backpack. His hands trembled as he zipped the pack, not from the cold, but from fear. Fear of reliving the old pain. Fear of believing again, only to lose again. But there was something more frightening than that. Standing still and doing nothing. The trail to the cliff. Lucas followed the old path heading south. Weeds crackled beneath the snow under his boots. His heart pounded like war drums every time the cliff's edge peeked through the trees. The terrain was treacherous, one wrong step, and you could fall straight into the deep gorge. He knew that. Too well. The cliff where Shadow had slipped wasn't far from here. Lucas stopped and pulled the binoculars from his bag. Through the frosted glass, the wild horse appeared faintly in the morning mist. Still there. still standing motionless like a living statue. Its ash-gray coat blended with the stone, except for the strange scar on its left shoulder, clear and distinct, like a mark carved by fate. Lucas swallowed hard. "Wait for me," he murmured, facing nature and himself. The slope was steep. Icy rocks made every step a nerve-wracking gamble. At times, Lucas had to crawl on all fours, anchoring himself by wedging the rope into cracks in the stone. A sudden gust of wind slammed into him, causing him to stumble. His hand slipped from the edge, he nearly fell. He lay flat on the freezing rock, gasping for air. His heart beat so hard it ached. Then, suddenly, a faint sound. The soft clink of hooves tapping against stone. He sprang up. The wild horse was looking at him. The horse stood about 6 feet away. Its eyes were wide, panicked. Its nostrils flared, and its hind legs trembled. Lucas didn't rush. He slowly crouched, pulling a small cloth pouch from his coat. Inside were dried herbs and oats, things he used long ago to tend to wounded horses. "Easy now, you're okay," he said in a deep, gentle voice, speaking more to himself than the horse. The animal didn't move, but its ears turned toward him. That look, it wasn't the gaze of a creature on the verge of death. It was the gaze of a soul still fighting, still hoping for something. Lucas's eyes welled with tears. For the first time in years, his heart stirred, not out of fear, but because he felt something inside begin to live again. Lucas sat there beside the horse, no pressure, no signals, just silence. The horse slowly lowered its head. It didn't touch him, but it didn't walk away either. They sat like that, in the soft wind and the sunlight slanting through the clouded sky. No neighing, no speaking, just a silent cry echoing through both their hearts. Lucas sat motionless beside the wild horse as the sun began to rise over the mountain ridge. Neither of them moved. Only the light shifted gradually, revealing every scar on the horse's body, every line etched into the face of a man who had lost too much. It was one of those rare moments where time seemed to pause, a breath held between two lives, one man and one horse, saying everything without speaking a word. That's when Lucas noticed the long, jagged scar stretching from the horse's left shoulder down its flank, like a fire had once scorched through its body, leaving behind a mark that would never truly fade. "Ember," he whispered. The name leapt out of him like a spark from some forgotten place, wild, warm, painful, and yet hopeful. Ember, like the final glowing coal left behind after a great blaze, fragile, but still burning. Just like him. From that moment on, the horse wasn't just the wild one anymore. It was Ember. Lucas stepped closer to Ember, each step as though he were walking across the ashes of old memories. He extended his hand for the horse to smell, and Ember didn't pull away. Just a small gesture, but for Lucas, it was a silent agreement between two broken beings. As he looped the rope gently around Ember's neck, his hands trembled. Not from uncertainty, but from the fear that this rope might become the line between saving a life and losing it all over again. Suddenly, Ember panicked. Maybe it was the smell of antiseptic, or maybe it was instinct, the reflex of a wild creature sensing danger. The horse threw its head, jerked violently, and Lucas lost his footing. In an instant, they both nearly plunged off the edge. One side, hoofs thrashing in fear. The other, a man's hands, slick with cold sweat, clinging desperately to the rock. Lucas shouted, not out of fear for his life, but from the terror of losing again. He didn't lash out. He didn't scream. Instead, he breathed, steady, deep, and looked Ember straight in the eye, as if whispering, "I'm here. I'm not here to hurt you. Ember froze. Its breath came in rapid bursts. The tension in its body slowly began to loosen. Lucas stepped back, then gently approached again, not with the rope this time, but with a handful of dry grass and herbs. The horse looked at him. Longer this time. Deeper. And this time, it didn't flinch. Lucas gently tightened the rope, anchoring one end into a crevice in the rock. The other looped carefully around Ember's belly, exactly the way he'd been trained years ago, back when life still felt whole. A painful choice, save him or save yourself. As he began to pull, Lucas realized Ember's condition was worse than he thought. One of the hind legs was badly injured, maybe dislocated, maybe torn. Blood dripped steadily, painting the rock like the rhythm of a heart bleeding from within. He needed to act fast. But too fast, and the leg could break. Too slow, and the cliff could give way at any moment. Each second passed like the blade of a knife. Lucas stopped. He looked at Ember. At the blood. At the abyss. Then, in a voice barely audible, he said, "I choose you. Even if it means falling with you." Both saved. Both collapsed. Lucas gritted his teeth, hands burning, body shaking, and poured everything he had into pulling Ember up, inch by inch. His arms tore open, his palms bled. But slowly, Ember made it past the edge. And when both of them finally collapsed onto solid ground, Lucas heard the wind whisper past his ears, like nature itself was applauding in silence. He lay flat on his back, lungs screaming for air. Ember lay beside him, its head resting softly on his thigh. Neither said a word. None were needed. Only the sound of breathing. The pounding of hearts. And life, fragile, but realer than any vow could ever be. Above them, dark clouds had begun to gather. Snow fell again, gently, brushing against bare skin like a quiet warning from the mountain. Lucas tightened a blanket around Ember, his eyes scanning the fog trail that led back to the cabin, now barely visible in the distance. He didn't know if he had the strength to carry Ember home. But one thing he did know now. He wouldn't give up. Not this time. But nature gave them no time to breathe. Just as Lucas helped Ember to his feet, the western sky groaned like the voice of the earth itself. Bitter wind lashed against their faces, swirling the first flurries of snow down into the forest below like a silent warning. The storm had arrived. Lucas narrowed his eyes toward the snow-covered trail. Between the thick white haze and the searing ache in his muscles, he knew they wouldn't make it back to the cabin in time. He took a deep breath, tightened the rope in his hands, and signaled Ember to rise. The horse hesitated, wincing in pain, but didn't resist. It simply looked at him, trusting. As if to say, as long as you're here, I'll keep walking, no matter how far or cold the way home might be. Not 10 minutes after leaving the cliff's edge, the sky darkened sharply. Thick black clouds gathered like a monstrous beast roaring above the mountains. The wind was no longer just wind, it clawed through the air, dragging snow with it like white daggers. Lucas squinted into the chaos. He knew they couldn't make it back. Then he remembered, somewhere west, about a 30-minute walk, there was a rock formation shaped like a horseshoe. He'd passed it once while gathering firewood. He didn't know if it was still there. But in this freezing air that squeezed the lungs with every breath, in the storm howling like it wanted to tear the world apart, it was their only hope. "Come on, Ember, just a little farther," he said, gripping the lead rope tight, eyes locked on the treacherous snowy ground. By the time they found the cave, daylight was gone. The sky had turned to iron. Wind howled in waves, making the stone floor tremble under their feet. Lucas guided Ember inside, propped his backpack as a makeshift windbreak, and opened a tiny first aid kit, nearly empty. Just a few gauze strips, a little anti-inflammatory powder, and a half-used bottle of antiseptic. But it was more than nothing. Lucas knelt beside Ember. Each time he touched the wound, the horse flinched, but didn't kick, didn't pull away. Lucas carefully cleaned the dried blood, sprinkled the medicine, and wrapped it gently. His fingers were swollen and stiff with cold, but still moved with patience and care, as if he were soothing his own heart. Ember collapsed from exhaustion, shivering. Its back trembled with cold. Lucas pulled off his fur-lined coat and draped it over the horse's body. Then, from his pack, he retrieved the last remaining blanket and laid it across Ember's frame. He sat down beside him, fists clenched against the cold. But when he glanced over, Ember was staring at him. It wasn't the wide, panicked gaze from before. It wasn't the look of a wild animal. It was something softer, warmer, deeper. A gaze that said, "I understand. Thank you for not leaving me behind." Lucas felt his throat tighten. It had been so long since anyone, human or beast, had looked at him with such pure trust. Night fell swiftly and mercilessly. The blizzard still showed no signs of letting up. Lucas closed his eyes, head resting against the freezing cave wall, one hand still lightly wrapped around Ember's rope. And in that restless sleep, he dreamed. He saw himself standing in a vast golden field. The breeze was soft. The sun was warm. And in the distance stood Shadow, the horse he had lost all those years ago. But in the dream, Shadow didn't look at him with anger. It trotted up and gently touched its warm muzzle to his forehead, then turned and galloped away toward the place where sky and grass met. Lucas called after it, "I'm sorry." But the dream didn't answer in words. Only the steady rhythm of hoofs fading into peace. As if to say, "I never blamed you." Lucas opened his eyes. Ember was still there, asleep beside him. The small flame from his emergency lamp flickered weakly, casting soft shadows on the growing snow piled at the mouth of the cave. The storm wasn't over. But inside him, another storm had begun to quiet. He looked at Ember, curled beneath his coat, breath rising and falling like the pulse of life itself. And in that moment, Lucas knew he had made a promise. One that didn't need to be spoken aloud. Just one truth. He would never lose something precious again. Not ever again. The sky began to brighten, but peace had yet to return. Outside the cave, the blizzard had passed, but a thick blanket of snow remained, reaching up to Lucas's knees. The world had fallen into an eerie silence, no wind, no sound. Just one quiet rhythm echoed inside Lucas, the steady, pulsing beat of life. He turned his head. Ember was still there, sleeping like a child, its chest rising and falling beneath the blanket. Lucas exhaled slowly. A part of him, the part that had died with Shadow, was flickering back to life. Getting Ember out of the cave proved another challenge entirely. The snow was deep, the ground slick with ice. Ember's injuries turned every step into a battle. More than once, the horse collapsed forward onto the snow. Lucas, panicked, tightened the rope, rushing to support it with all the strength he had left. He didn't shout, didn't urge or demand. He simply whispered, "We've come too far to stop now. You can't give up." When they finally reached the cabin, Lucas froze. The door had been torn open by the storm. The roof was battered, punctured by fallen branches. Everything inside was soaked and scattered, as if the storm had torn through not just a shelter, but his life, once again. Lucas looked around. Ember stood beside him, trembling. If they didn't find new shelter, Ember wouldn't survive the night. Lucas pushed through his exhaustion and began repairing the shelter. He used every scrap of fabric, every plank of wood he could salvage, stacking pine branches against the frame. He patched a corner just large enough to block the wind and laid down hay for bedding. When Ember stepped inside, slow, unsteady, just then, the morning light slipped through a tear in the roof, landing gently across the horse's ash-gray coat. The scar along its side shimmered faintly. Lucas looked at him, not as an animal, but as a piece of his own soul, slowly being put back together. From that day on, every morning began with the quiet rhythm of Ember's breath. Lucas brewed tea, sat beside him, and read aloud from an old book, not because the horse could understand the words, but because his own voice had been missing for far too long. Then something strange began to happen. Whenever Lucas read, Ember would stretch its neck and nudge his elbow, gently, insistently. As if saying, "Keep going." 3 days after the storm cleared, Ember was able to walk a few steps around the clearing. Lucas loosely looped the old rope around his neck and led him through the rocks near the cabin. Sometimes Ember would pause and look up at the sky. Sometimes he'd brush his nose against Lucas's hand, then walk on. By the 5th day, Ember stepped outside the shelter on his own. Not to leave, but as if to say, "I'm ready now to walk with you." That evening, as the sun dipped behind the trees, Lucas was sweeping the yard when Ember approached, and did something that shattered every wall he had left. The horse lowered his head. Then, in one slow, gentle motion, Ember pressed his nose to Lucas's chest. No fear. No hesitation. Only complete trust. Lucas bit his lip. The tears came on their own. Because for the first time in years, he didn't feel like he was simply surviving. He felt like he was alive again. That night, Lucas opened an old, weathered journal. And for the first time in years, he wrote, "I don't know if I saved Ember, or if Ember saved me. But I know, from the moment he touched me, my heart has no longer been silent." He set the pen down and turned. Ember was curled up on the hay, peaceful, like a quiet flame, warm enough to thaw a soul once frozen beyond repair. Lucas whispered, "Thank you for not giving up. Thank you for finding your way to me." Peace always has its limits. A week after the storm, the skies cleared, bright and blue. The forest outside the cabin whispered softly with wind, as if the blizzard had never happened. Ember was healing faster than Lucas expected. His legs no longer trembled, his gait steadied, and his eyes regained the fire they once held, though now gentler. And then, for the first time in years, someone appeared in the place Lucas thought the world had forgotten. Lucas was checking Ember's scar when the rumble of a jeep echoed from down the slope. He snapped upright, eyes narrowing toward the sound. Before he could react, the vehicle stopped just outside the cabin. A woman stepped out. Silver hair. Sharp but kind eyes. She wore an old fur coat and glasses with a chain. Lucas recognized her instantly. Ella. A former colleague from the veterinary clinic. The only one who didn't ask questions when Lucas disappeared. "Oh my God, Lucas. You've really been here all these years?" He said nothing. Just stared in silence. Ella walked toward Ember and froze at the sight of the scar. "A Mustang? Out here? How did one even survive this long?" Lucas clenched his jaw, his hand instinctively tightening around the lead rope. Ella turned to him, her voice more serious now. You should let me take him back to the rescue center. We have the proper equipment, shelter, vets, he'd recover much faster. And if he meets the criteria, he might be released back into a herd. Lucas stood frozen. He looked at Ember, who was slowly walking toward him, gently pressing his nose to Lucas's sleeve, as if it was the most natural thing in the world. Ella noticed, and softened her tone. I get it, there's something special between you two. But you can't keep him forever, Lucas. He's a wild horse. He needs freedom. Freedom. The word cut through him like a blade. Lucas couldn't sleep. He sat beside the fire, Ella's words looping in his mind. You can't keep him forever. He needs freedom. He stepped outside. Ember was lying nearby, calm under the silver glow of the moon. Lucas walked toward him, hand outstretched to touch that warm shoulder. But Ember rose and walked straight into the trees. No panic. No fear. No glance back. Lucas nearly chased after him, but something in his mind held him back. Maybe he's just wandering. Maybe he'll be back by morning. No hoofbeats. No familiar gaze waiting at the clearing. Lucas searched the forest behind the cabin. He called out. Shouted. But the trees replied only with wind and birdsong. Then he saw it. Fresh marks on the fence near the forest's edge. Hoof prints. Scattered. Erratic. Like something, or someone, had tried to force a creature that didn't want to go. He rushed back to the cabin, breath sharp in his chest. Something wasn't right. Lucas ran down the dirt road toward town. At the third fork, he spotted fresh tire tracks. And there, in the grass, a snapped lead rope. His hands balled into fists. He bolted down the path until he reached a temporary rescue shelter built into a hillside. Ella's. In the distance, he saw Ember, locked behind metal bars. His eyes were wide, empty of light. And they seemed to ask one silent question. Why? Ella emerged from the shelter, surprised. Lucas? What are you doing here? He didn't answer. He approached the pen. Ember stretched his head forward, nose pressed to the bars. Lucas leaned in and touched his forehead to Ember's. I'm sorry. I was wrong to think I could choose for you. He turned to Ella. If I build my own sanctuary, close to here, if I dedicate the rest of my life to caring for animals like him, do I have the right to keep him? Ella looked at him for a long time, then slowly nodded. With one condition. He has to choose you. Lucas opened the gate. No calls. No commands. He simply stood there. Ember stepped out. Paused. Looked at him. That moment stretched on forever. And then he walked toward Lucas, pressed his nose gently to his hand, and stood quietly beside him. No rope. No pen. No cage. Lucas smiled, eyes wet. Freedom isn't just the ability to go anywhere. Freedom is choosing to stay when your heart says this is home. Some goodbyes don't begin with words. Since returning from the rescue center, something between Lucas and Ember had quietly changed. It wasn't distance. It was silence, deeper than usual. Ember still walked beside him. Still ate. Still listened every morning as Lucas read aloud. But on every full moon, he would stand for hours in the yard, staring out toward the forest. No neighing. No restlessness. Just stillness, as if he were listening to a voice only he could hear. Lucas noticed something that unsettled him: hoof prints around the cabin. They weren't Ember's. Smaller. Sharper. Deeper. As if another wild horse had come close, then turned away. One night, Lucas stayed up. He hid behind the trees, waiting to see what was happening. And then, he saw them. A herd of wild Mustangs. They appeared silently, like a mist. Standing just beyond the tree line, only a few dozen feet from the cabin. Ember stepped forward. Paused. Looked back at Lucas. Then slowly walked toward the herd. Lucas stood frozen. This wasn't the first time. Ember had met with this herd on other nights. Maybe they were his old family. Maybe that was where he truly belonged. And Lucas knew. To keep him now would be to keep him out of selfishness. But just as he stepped out from the brush, something unexpected happened. The herd bolted. All but one. Ember stayed. Didn't chase. Didn't panic. He just turned his head and looked at Lucas. Lucas swallowed hard, his eyes stinging in the moonlight. You can go, if that's what you want. The next morning, Lucas led Ember to the highest hill. The one where the valley stretched endlessly toward the horizon. The wind was cold, but not cruel. Lucas removed the lead rope. Said nothing. Ember stood beside him, gazing far beyond the trees. After a long pause, he took a few steps forward. Then stopped. Turned his head. And held Lucas's gaze for what felt like an eternity. As if to ask, "If I go, will you be okay?" Lucas nodded, barely. Though it felt like something inside him cracked. And then, Ember turned away. And ran. He didn't look back. Not even once. And then, something unbelievable happened. Lucas collapsed on the hillside, burying his face in his hands. Letting the ache pour out, for the first time in years. He didn't know how long he sat there. Until he heard it. The sound of hooves. No, it couldn't be. He looked up, saw nothing. But the sound came again. Closer. And then, emerging from the mist, Ember returned. But he wasn't alone. Beside him walked a white mare, pregnant, glowing under the soft light. Lucas went still. Ember approached, bowed his head, and touched Lucas's hand with his nose. As if introducing her. Lucas understood. Ember had made his choice. And he had brought his new family with him. A heart that doesn't just hold. It expands. Lucas built another shelter behind the cabin. He no longer lived alone. He became the keeper of a growing herd of free Mustangs. Wanderers who had once been lost. But who found their way back. Through the quiet light of a man who thought he'd lost everything. That night, as Lucas sat in the yard beneath a sky of silver, Ember came and rested beside him. No rope. No stall. No need for barriers. Only one thing remained. True love is freedom that knows exactly where it belongs and still chooses to return. Some things leave and yet never truly disappear. Ever since Ember returned, alongside the mare carrying new life, something shifted in the world around Lucas. The silence of the deep forest was no longer lonely. In its place came the soft rhythm of hooves, the warm exhale of breath, and gentle nickers at dawn. Lucas named the mare Snowdrop. Soft. Pure. And the first sign of a new season in his life. A morning unlike any other. It started like any other day. And yet, something felt different. Lucas couldn't explain it. He only knew that when he saw Ember standing motionless by the gate, eyes fixed on the horizon, something inside him whispered, "Change is coming." He reached for his old camera, dusty and long untouched since the day Shadow died. This time, he wanted to capture everything. Lucas began to write again. Not to retell the past, but to hold on to the moments. For someone in the future. Or maybe, for himself, should everything ever shift again. Ember isn't just a horse. He's the breath of hope. The last echo left behind after I believed my heart had gone quiet. And now, with Snowdrop close to giving birth, I understand. Some lives begin in the very place where others end. A week later, Lucas printed the first batch of photos. One stood out. Ember on a hilltop, Snowdrop behind him, the morning sun breaking just over the ridge. Ember's eyes stared directly into the lens. Powerful. Calm. Free. Lucas uploaded it to a wildlife photography forum as a quiet offering. No one expected what would happen next. The image went viral. It spread across the internet. Wildlife photographers called it the gaze of a wild soul. Reporters wanted interviews. People asked to visit. They wanted to meet Lucas. To write about Ember. One afternoon, buried in a pile of thank you notes from around the world, Lucas found a plain envelope with no return address. Inside was a photo of a herd of Mustangs taken somewhere far away. And among them, a horse with the same scar on its left shoulder. Lucas froze. It wasn't Ember. It was another horse. A long-lost sibling? An ancestor? Lucas reached out to a wild Mustang researcher in Colorado. Through markings, DNA, and archived records, they confirmed. Ember was a direct descendant of a legendary Mustang bloodline. One believed to have perished in a wildfire 17 years ago. A rare wild strain, untouched by domestic breeding. Pure. Untamed. Preserved by time and luck. Ember was more than a horse. He was living proof that nature's wild heart had survived. A national conservation group contacted Lucas. They offered to take Ember to a federal reserve to breed and preserve his rare genetics. With top veterinarians, state-of-the-art facilities, protection. Lucas went quiet. For a long time. And then he said, "If he leaves, it'll be because others believe it's best for him. But I won't decide for him again." The next morning, Snowdrop gave birth. A small foal, its coat a shimmering blend of white and ash gray, legs dark as charcoal. And on its left shoulder, a faint scar. Lucas broke down in tears. Because in that moment, he understood. Ember didn't need to go anywhere. Freedom had already found its heir. And life would go on beating beneath the shadows of the forest, where a once broken heart was slowly, gently mended by the soft echo of hoofs from spirits that could never be tamed. Some lessons can't be found in books, only understood through the heart. Lucas still lived in the small cabin at the edge of the Sierra Nevada forest. But now, what once was a refuge for a broken man had become a sanctuary for a herd of free Mustangs. Each morning, he awoke to the soft whinnies of the foal, Ember and Snowdrop's son, playing under the shade of the pines. And each night, he sat quietly in the yard, watching moonlight filter through the leaves, with Ember beside him. No rope. No command. He stayed because he chose to. A small idea becomes something bigger. Lucas named the place Ember's Grace, not because Ember needed grace, but because Ember had been the grace life gave back to him. He began taking in injured or abandoned horses. Children from nearby towns came to learn how to listen to horses with their hearts, not reins. Adults came not for the horses, but because something in them had also gone quiet. Lucas didn't teach. He simply told stories. The story of a wild horse and the man who once gave up on the world. A letter from afar and an unexpected journey. One day, Lucas received an invitation from a university on the East Coast, home to a department studying animal behavior and therapeutic psychology. They didn't want research. They wanted experience. Lucas hesitated. It had been a long time since he'd left the mountains. But one crisp autumn morning, Ember stepped forward and gently touched his hand, just like he had the very first time. Lucas understood. It was time to share their story with more people. Goodbye isn't always the end. Lucas locked the cabin. He mounted a wooden sign above the door, carved with the words Ember's Grace. Then he left, carrying a small bag and a worn notebook filled with the days no one else had seen. And the Mustangs remained. Peaceful. Free. Untamed, but deeply rooted. Lucas's truck disappeared beyond the ridge. Ember stood on the hilltop, watching. Beside him stood Snowdrop. And between them, their young foal chased butterflies in the morning light. The sun rose, casting golden light across the foal's shoulder, where a faint scar shimmered. Not because it had vanished, but because you don't have to remember every wound to know you've been hurt. Lucas didn't know how long he'd share their story, or whether he'd one day return to Sierra Nevada. But he knew one thing for certain. Somewhere out there, our hearts still waiting for a wild gaze like Ember's. To remind them, we don't have to be perfect. Only honest. And willing to come home. When we've found where we belong. Life lesson, distilled from one man, one horse, and the healing in between. Life doesn't always need a great fall or tragic loss to transform us. Sometimes, it only takes one look, one gaze as true and steady as Ember's, to pull someone out of the darkness they've lived in for too long. We spend so much time chasing freedom, forgetting that real freedom isn't about going anywhere we want, it's about the right to stay, with someone, in some place, or within a feeling that lets us be fully ourselves. Not everyone in life needs saving. But every heart, even the ones shattered by silence, deserves to be heard, to be touched, and to be trusted again. Healing doesn't come from forgetting the past, it comes from no longer fearing it, from learning to live with the scar, in love. The story of Lucas and Ember is more than a man and a horse, it's a quiet reminder that true love doesn't try to tame. It creates the space for a soul to be wild, and still choose to come back.